I stood there longer than I expected, one hand resting on the edge of the kitchen counter, as if I needed to remind myself it was solid and real, and not another thing that could disappear while I wasn't looking. The air smelled faintly like lavender and lemon cleaner, exactly the way I'd left it. And for a moment I felt suspended between two versions of my life, the one where everything had been stolen from me, and the one where I had somehow clawed it back piece by fragile piece. My legs trembled, partly from the surgery and partly from the emotional weight of standing in a place that almost been erased from my future. Donna kept talking behind me. Something about how she'd chased away a salesman who kept knocking, but her voice blurred into the background as I slowly moved deeper into the living room. The couch dipped beneath me as I sat, careful not to twist my spine, and the silence wrapped around me like a blanket. It wasn't the same silence I'd felt in the hospital, the sterile quiet filled with machines and strangers. This was my silence, chosen and earned, and it carried a strange kind of peace. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. For a split second, my heart jumped, expecting Gail's name to flash across the screen again, but it was only Josie asking if I made it inside okay. I typed back slowly, thumbs stiff, telling her yes and adding a sunflower emoji, because Donna insisted they symbolized resilience. The legal process kept moving even after the wedding collapsed. Gail tried to argue that she'd acted out of love, that everything she did was for family. But love doesn't forge signatures or drain bank accounts while someone is unconscious. The detectives called me twice that week to clarify timelines. Each question forced me to relive the details, the chamomile tea, the stack of papers, the way her voice sounded so gentle while she handed me the pen. I answered every question calmly, but afterward I sat on my balcony wrapped in a blanket, watching cars pass on Pelham Road and wondering how someone who gave birth to me could look at my fear and see an opportunity. Work sent flowers. The entire vet clinic signed the card, even Dr. Reynolds, who never writes more than 2 words on anything. They said they missed me, that the golden retriever named Max still tried to jump onto the exam table every time someone opened the door like he expected me to walk in. I cried reading that because animals had always felt safer than people lately. Animals don't manipulate legal documents or rewrite history to suit themselves. They either trust you or they don't, and you always know where you stand. A week later, Warren called to tell me the prosecutor had officially filed charges. His voice stayed calm and professional, but I heard the quiet satisfaction beneath it. He said the case was strong, stronger than most family exploitation cases because of the paper trail Gail left behind. When I hung up, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Justice doesn't arrive with fireworks and arrives like paperwork and phone calls and slow-moving calendars. Gail sent a letter after that. Not a text, not a voicemail. A handwritten letter slipped into my mailbox. Her handwriting curled across the page exactly the way it had when she used to write notes in my lunchbox when I was a kid. She said she didn't understand why I was punishing her. She said families forgive each other. She said I was letting strangers turn me against my own blood. I read it twice and then folded it back into the envelope without responding. For the first time in my life, I realized silence wasn't weakness. It was a boundary. Paige never apologized either. She posted vague quotes online about betrayal and fake loyalty, and mutual friends sent me screenshots like I needed proof of what I already knew. The strangest part was how quickly the world moved on. The wedding planner booked new clients. The venue hosted other events. Even Trent eventually stopped asking Warren for updates. Life continued, indifferent to the chaos that had nearly swallowed mine. Physical therapy started at week 7. The therapist, a woman named Carla with bright purple sneakers and zero patience for self-pity, made me walk slow laps across a padded floor while she counted each step. Every movement reminded me how fragile my body still was, but it also reminded me that I was healing. Pain faded into soreness, and soreness faded into strength. The first day I managed to stand without the walker, I laughed out loud, a raw surprise sound that echoed off the clinic walls. One evening, Josie came over with takeout and we sat cross-legged on the floor because I still couldn't handle chairs for long. She asked me if I hated my mother now. I thought about it for a long time before answering. Hate felt heavy, like carrying a backpack full of stones up a hill that never ended. What I felt instead was distance, a clear line where love used to be unconditional. I didn't wish Gail harm, but I no longer wished for her approval either, and that realization felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. The court dates approached slowly. Gail's attorney requested continuances, trying to delay the inevitable, but every delay only made the truth clearer. People who once believed Gailshan of events started to step back. Church friends stopped inviting her to events. Neighbors whispered. The image she'd spent decades crafting began to crack under the weight of facts she couldn't charm away. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, I found a photograph of my grandmother Beverly sitting at the kitchen table in this very condo, laughing with a cup of tea in her hand. I traced the edge of the frame and remembered the way she used to say, "A home is only safe when the person inside knows their own worth." At the time I thought she meant keeping the doors locked. Now I understood she meant something deeper. The first time I slept through the night without waking from pain or nightmares. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the blinds and realized something inside me had shifted. I wasn't waiting for another disaster. I wasn't bracing for the next betrayal. I was just living, making coffee, watering the houseplant Donna saved, checking messages from friends instead of lawyers. Months passed. The case moved toward resolution. Gail's attorney eventually approached Warren with a plea negotiation. I didn't attend those meetings, but Warren explained everything afterward with careful neutrality. Restitution, probation, a permanent record. Consequences that felt both too heavy and not heavy enough. I listened, nodded, and realized closure wasn't something the court could hand me. Closure was standing in my own living room without fear. The day I finally returned to work, Max the golden retriever nearly knocked me over with excitement. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and dog treats, and for the first time since the surgery, my life felt ordinary again. Clients asked gentle questions, coworkers hugged me carefully, and I realized how many people had quietly supported me while my own family turned against me. That night, I sat on my balcony watching the sky turn orange and pink over Greenville. Cars moved steadily below, strangers living their own complicated stories, and I felt something I hadn't felt since before the surgery, a sense of future. Not the future Gail imagined for me, not the one built around sacrifice and silence, but one I chose for myself. I thought about the voicemail again. The sweet voice that once felt like comfort, and now sounded like a warning I'd finally learned to hear. And instead of breaking me, it had pushed me toward a version of myself that refused to be small or convenient ever again. For the first time in months, I smiled without forcing it, and the condo felt warmer somehow, like it recognized that the person who lived there now wasn't the same woman who signed papers with shaking hands in a hospital gown. She was someone who survived betrayal, rebuilt her life step by careful step, and finally understood that family isn't defined by blood or history, but by the people who stand beside you when everything else falls apart. The days settled into a rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar, because it didn't revolve around waiting for the next problem. I woke early, stretched slowly like Carla taught me, and watched sunlight creep across the living room floor. Sometimes I still caught myself checking the locks twice before bed, not because I thought Gail would show up, but because trust, once broken, takes longer to rebuild than any muscle in my back. Donna started bringing over small plants every weekend, insisting the condo needed more life after everything that happened. She never asked for details about the case unless I brought it up first. And that quiet respect made her presence feel safe. Warren called one afternoon while I was reorganizing the bookshelf Gail had once insisted looked too cluttered. His voice carried the careful tone he used when delivering news that mattered. The plea agreement had been accepted. Gail would avoid prison, but she would live on the weight of a criminal record, financial restitution, and court supervision. When he finished explaining the terms, I thanked him and set the phone down slowly, expecting to feel relief or anger or something dramatic. Instead, I felt a strange stillness, like a chapter closing with a quiet click instead of a slam. Josie took me out for coffee to celebrate, though neither of us used that word out loud. The cafe buzzed with conversations, milk steaming behind the counter, the smell of espresso hanging thick in the air. She watched me carefully, searching my face for signs that I was falling apart again. But I wasn't. I was tired. Yes, and still healing, but I wasn't shattered anymore. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand, and I realized that the people who stayed gentle with me were the ones who truly deserved space in my life. Paige tried to reach out once. A short message, stiff and formal, asking if we could talk, woman to woman. I stared at the notification for a long time before turning my phone face down. I didn't hate her, but I no longer felt responsible for repairing relationships I didn't break. Silence felt like clarity. Work grew busier as summer approached. Puppies filled the clinic, owners laughed nervously while holding leashes, and I found myself smiling more easily. Dr. Reynolds joked that I moved slower than before, but there was warmth behind his teasing. Healing had changed the way I walked, but it also changed the way I saw people. I paid more attention to small kindnesses, a coworker bringing me tea, a client leaving a thank you card, Max wagging his tail every time I entered the room as if he knew I needed reassurance. At home, evenings became my favorite part of the day. I'd sit on the balcony wrapped in a light blanket, listening to distant traffic and watching the sky shift from blue to deep violet. Sometimes I thought about Beverly and how fiercely she protected this space for me without ever saying it directly. I imagined her watching everything unfold, shaking her head at the chaos but quietly proud that I fought back. The first time I saw Gail after the charges were finalized happened by accident at a grocery store. She stood near the produce section, her shoulders slightly hunched, scanning labels, trying to avoid being recognized. For a second, I froze. The woman in front of me looked smaller than I remembered, less polished, like the world had finally stopped bending around her. She noticed me a moment later, her eyes widening with a mixture of shame and stubbornness. We didn't speak. We simply looked at each other across a stack of oranges, and then I turned my cart and walked away. My hands trembled, but my step stayed steady. That night I didn't cry. I expected to, but the tears never came. Instead, I felt something settle inside me, a final acceptance that the relationship we once had no longer existed. I wasn't a doll trying to earn approval anymore. I was a woman protecting her own peace. Physical therapy advanced to strength training. Carla added small weights and resistance bands, pushing me to trust my body again. Each session left me exhausted but proud. She told me healing wasn't just about muscles. It was about believing you deserve to stand upright in your own life. I carried that sentence with me long after I left the clinic. Donna organized a small dinner at my place one Saturday evening. Josie came, along with 2 coworkers from the clinic. We ate pasta at the dining table, laughter echoing through the condo, and I realized how long it had been since I felt comfortable hosting anyone. The space felt alive again, filled with voices that didn't carry judgment or expectation. After everyone left, I stood in the quiet kitchen and let the happiness linger. Warren eventually stopped calling as often. The case moved into its final administrative stages, and my role in it faded. The legal storm that once dominated every thought slowly drifted into the background. I started focusing on things that had nothing to do with survival, redecorating the bedroom, planning a short trip to the mountains with Josie, even considering adopting a rescue dog of my own. One afternoon, while cleaning out old emails, I found a message Gail sent years ago after my first promotion at the clinic. She'd written that she was proud of me, that she admired my independence. Reading it now felt surreal, like looking at a photograph from a different lifetime. I didn't know which version of her had been real, the supportive mother, or the one who saw my vulnerability as an opportunity, but I realized I didn't need to solve that mystery to move forward. The seasons shifted again. Leaves turned gold, then red, drifting across Pelham Road in slow spirals. I walked more confidently, pain fading into memory rather than daily reality. Sometimes I caught my reflection in store windows and barely recognized the woman staring back, stronger posture, calmer eyes, a quiet resilience that hadn't existed before everything fell apart. News about Paige reached me through mutual friends. Her wedding never happened. Trent moved away for work, and the elaborate plans she once flaunted online disappeared without explanation. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing that. I felt distance, like observing a story that no longer belonged to me. One evening, Josie asked if I ever thought about forgiving Gail. I considered the question carefully. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about inviting someone back into your life. It was about releasing the hold their actions had over your emotions. I told her I was working towards something quieter than forgiveness, acceptance. Accepting that people reveal who they are through choices, and that my job was simply to believe what I saw. The anniversary of the surgery arrived almost unnoticed. I woke up early, made coffee, and sat on the balcony watching sunlight spill across the rooftops. A year earlier I had been lying in a hospital bed, unaware that my entire life was being rearranged without my consent. Now I was here, breathing easily, surrounded by evidence that I had survived more than ever thought possible. Later that day, I drove to a nearby park and walked slowly along a trail lined with tall trees. Children laughed in the distance, dogs barked happily, and the world felt wide and open instead of threatening. I paused at a bench overlooking a small pond and closed my eyes, letting the breeze move through my hair. For the first time since everything happened, I felt gratitude, not for the betrayal itself, but for the strength I discovered because of it. When I returned home that evening, a small package waited at my door. Inside was a simple silver bracelet with a tiny sunflower charm. There was no note, but I knew it was from Donna. I fastened it around my wrist and smiled, touched by the quiet reminder that chosen family often shows up in the smallest gestures. Life didn't transform into perfection after that. Some nights I still woke from dreams where my phone buzzed with another devastating voicemail. Some days I felt a lingering sadness when I passed mothers and daughters laughing together in stores. But those moments no longer defined me. They were just echoes, fading gradually as new memories took their place. One night, sitting at the dining table with paperwork spread around me, I realized I was planning for the future again, budgeting for travel, considering continuing education at the clinic, even exploring the idea of mentoring younger staff. The woman who once felt powerless in a hospital gown now made decisions with confidence and clarity. I turned off the lights before bed and stood in the doorway of the living room for a moment, looking around at everything I fought to keep. The walls held stories, not just of loss, but of resilience and quiet victories that no one else fully understood. I whispered a soft thank you to Beverly, to Donna, to Josie, to every version of myself that refused to give up even when betrayal threatened to erase me. As I lay down, the city hummed softly outside, and instead of fear, I felt a steady sense of belonging, not to a family defined by obligation, but to a life I built on honesty, boundaries, and the unshakable knowledge that I deserved to stand strong in my own home. I didn't scream when the lawyer slid the printed document toward me. I didn't cry either. My fingers just rested on the edge of the paper like it might burn me if I pressed too hard. My name was there. My signature too. But I had never signed anything like this, not consciously, not willingly. The date stamped on the page was the same day I was lying on an operating table with anesthesia flooding my veins. He watched my face carefully, like he was measuring how much truth I could survive in one moment. I asked him to tell me everything slowly, because my body still felt fragile, and my thoughts moved like they were wrapped in fog. He explained how the power of attorney had been used to authorize the sale, how the buyer transferred funds within hours, how my bank activity showed movements I couldn't remember making. Every word felt heavier than the last. I remembered my mother holding my hand before surgery, whispering that she would take care of everything. I had believed her because I wanted to believe someone loved me enough to protect me when I couldn't protect myself. That memory hurt more than the legal details. The lawyer's voice softened when he said we could fight it. He said the timing alone raised serious questions. He said courts didn't look kindly on people who used medical vulnerability for financial gain. I nodded, but inside I felt hollow. I wasn't thinking about lawsuits or revenge. I was thinking about the silence between my mother and me since I woke up. She had sent one message. Just one. A short text telling me not to overreact. And that everything had been done for the good of the family. The words sat in my phone like poison. I read them over and over, trying to find a hint of regret that wasn't there. When I got home from the lawyer's office, I sat in the rented room that barely fit my suitcase and stared at the wall. It didn't feel real that I had lived years in a place that no longer belonged to me. My neighbor from the old building had sent me a picture earlier that morning. My furniture was gone. The balcony plants I had grown from tiny cuttings were missing. Even the wind chimes my father had given me years ago had disappeared. I didn't know whether to grieve the loss of a home or the loss of a mother. Days passed in a blur of paperwork and quiet anger. The more evidence we gathered, the more the story unfolded. My sister's wedding venue had been paid in full the same week my condo sold. The invoice matched the exact amount that vanished from my account. My stomach twisted when I saw her smiling engagement photos online. Standing in a garden decorated with lights that looked too expensive to belong to someone who had always complained about money. I tried calling my mother one last time before filing the official complaint. She answered after 3 rings, her voice calm like nothing had happened. She told me I was being dramatic. She said families made sacrifices for each other. She said I would understand one day. I asked her if she had ever considered asking me first. There was a long silence on the line, and then she changed the subject to my health like she was checking off a chore. Something inside me closed during that conversation. Not loudly, not with anger, just quietly, like a door that finally realized no one was coming through it. The legal process started moving faster than I expected. Depositions were scheduled. Financial records were reviewed. The buyer of my condo submitted a statement saying they had been assured everything was legitimate. I didn't blame them. They were just another piece in a chain of decisions I never agreed to. One afternoon my sister showed up at my temporary place unannounced. She stood in the doorway wearing an expensive coat, her eyes scanning the small space like she was uncomfortable breathing the same air. She said she didn't know things were this bad. She said Mom told her I had agreed to help with the wedding. Her voice sounded unsure, like she was trying to convince herself. I asked her if she ever wondered why I would sell the only stable thing in my life right before surgery. She didn't answer. Instead, she looked at the floor and whispered that it was too late to undo anything now. That sentence hurt more than if she had shouted at me. After she left, I realized something important. The betrayal wasn't just about money. It was about how easily they had rewritten my role in their story. I was no longer a person with boundaries, I was a resource to be used. The court hearing arrived sooner than expected. Walking into that room felt like stepping into a version of my life I never imagined. My mother avoided my eyes at first. She looked smaller than I remembered, but her posture was still proud. When the judge asked her questions, she spoke confidently about family decisions and implied consent. She said she had acted in my best interest. Hearing those words made my chest ache because they sounded rehearsed. My lawyer presented medical records showing I had been under heavy sedation when the documents were finalized. The timeline lined up perfectly. Every signature, every transfer, every approval happened while I couldn't even hold a conversation. For the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker across my mother's face. During a break, she approached me in the hallway. She said we could settle quietly. She said dragging this through court would embarrass everyone. I asked her if she had thought about embarrassment when she emptied my life savings. Her lips tightened, and she walked away without another word. The decision didn't come immediately. Weeks stretched into months filled with waiting. I started rebuilding small pieces of my life. I found a new therapist who listened without judgment. I began writing down everything I felt instead of swallowing it. Some nights I still woke up thinking I heard the familiar sounds of my old home, and it took a few seconds to remember where I was. Then the call came. The judge ruled that the power of attorney had been abused. The sale was declared invalid due to undue influence and lack of informed consent. The buyer would be compensated through insurance channels, and the funds traced back to my account were to be returned. My mother's financial control over my affairs was revoked permanently. I didn't celebrate. I just sat there holding the phone, letting the silence settle around me. Justice felt quieter than I expected. The hardest moment came later, when my mother sent another message. This time there were no explanations, just a short line saying she never meant to hurt me. I stared at it for a long time. Part of me wanted to reply with anger, to list every sleepless night and every tear she never saw. But another part of me understood that words wouldn't change what had happened. I typed a simple response telling her I needed distance. That trust wasn't something she could demand back. My hands shook as I pressed send, but afterward I felt lighter, like I had finally chosen myself without apologizing. Moving back into my condo months later felt surreal. The walls looked the same, but I didn't. I walked through each room slowly, touching surfaces like I was meeting them for the first time. The balcony was empty, so I bought new plants and arranged them in the sunlight. The wind chimes were gone forever, but the breeze still sounded familiar. One evening I sat at the dining table alone, a cup of tea warming my hands. I realized that the biggest thing I had regained wasn't property or money, it was my voice, the ability to say no even to people who once held the title of family. The past didn't disappear. Some nights I still replayed memories of my mother brushing my hair when I was cheering at my school events. Those moments were real too, and letting go of them felt like grieving someone who was still alive. Healing wasn't a straight line. It twisted and turned, bringing unexpected waves of sadness and relief. But for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something I had to survive. It felt like something I could shape with my own choices. I didn't know if my mother would ever truly understand what she had done. Maybe she would always believe she was right. Maybe my sister would keep living a life built on a foundation she never questioned. I couldn't control that anymore. All I could do was open the windows, let the evening air fill the space, and promise myself that no one would ever sign my life away again. The first night I slept back in my condo felt unfamiliar, even though every wall carried pieces of my past. I lay awake longer than I expected, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside and the faint creak of the floor as it settled. My body remembered the space before my mind did. Every corner held a memory that didn't feel entirely safe yet, like walking through a place that had been broken and carefully stitched back together. Morning came softly. Sunlight spilled across the balcony where new plants waited in clay pots. I watered them slowly, letting the simple routine calm the restless energy inside me. For months my life had been nothing but paperwork and questions, and now the silence felt louder than any courtroom. I started rebuilding small habits that had disappeared during the chaos. Cooking breakfast instead of grabbing something quick. Opening the windows each afternoon. Writing in my journal before sleep. The therapist said routine helped the nervous system remember safety. At first it felt forced, but gradually the rhythm became real. Messages from extended relatives began appearing once news of the court decision spread. Some were supportive, telling me I had done the right thing. Others tried to stay neutral, saying families should forgive each other no matter what. I didn't answer most of them. I had learned that not every opinion deserved space in my healing. One evening my sister called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded different, softer than before. She said she wanted to talk somewhere neutral. I hesitated for a long time before agreeing. When we met at a quiet cafe, she avoided my eyes at first, stirring her drink without taking a sip. She admitted that she hadn't known the full truth when the wedding was being planned. She said our mother told her I insisted on helping financially because I didn't want to feel left out. Hearing that lie out loud felt strange. Like a story about someone else. My sister's voice cracked when she said she felt guilty now, especially after seeing the legal documents during the investigation. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to believe her, to rebuild something that felt like family again. Another part remembered how easily she had walked away from my pain when it was inconvenient. We talked for a long time, but the conversation felt fragile, like glass that could shatter if either of us moved too quickly. When we left, she hugged me carefully, unsure if it was welcome. I didn't pull away, but I didn't hold on either. Some relationships needed time to prove whether they could exist in a new form. Work became my next focus. I returned slowly, adjusting to the pace after months of recovery. Colleagues treated me gently at first, asking about my health more than anything else. I realized how different it felt to be around people who respected boundaries without question. There was no manipulation, no guilt hidden in kindness. Just simple human decency. Weeks turned into months. The legal process officially closed, and the last financial transfers settled into my account. I used part of the money to renovate the living room, repainting the walls in a lighter color that made the space feel new. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about creating a version of the home that belonged fully to me. One rainy afternoon I found an old photo album tucked behind a shelf. It held pictures from childhood, birthdays, vacations, moments where my mother's smile looked warm and genuine. I sat on the floor flipping through the pages, feeling a complicated mix of love and grief. People weren't just one thing. The woman who once protected me was the same person who had taken advantage of my vulnerability. Accepting both truths felt like the hardest part of moving forward. A letter arrived from my mother weeks later. She didn't call anymore, maybe sensing that silence was safer than confrontation. The letter was written carefully, every sentence measured. She said she missed me. She said she regretted how everything had unfolded. She didn't fully admit wrongdoing, but the tone carried something softer than before. I read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope and placed it in a drawer. Forgiveness didn't mean immediate access. That was a lesson I repeated to myself whenever guilt tried to creep in. Life slowly filled with new experiences. I joined a small weekend art class just to do something unrelated to the past. Painting felt awkward at first, but there was something freeing about creating without expectations. The instructor talked about layers, how mistakes could be covered with new colors instead of erased. The metaphor stayed with me long after the class ended. One evening after class, I walked home under a sky painted with soft orange light. For the first time since everything happened, I felt a quiet sense of pride. Not because I had won a legal battle, but because I had survived something that once felt impossible. The anniversary of my surgery approached faster than I expected. I wasn't sure how I would feel that day, but I decided to spend it alone at the beach outside the city. The sound of waves felt grounding, a reminder that life moved forward whether I held onto the past or not. I sat on the sand watching the horizon and thought about the version of myself who had trusted without question. I didn't judge her anymore. She had done the best she could with the love she believed was real. That night I returned home and lit a candle on the balcony. The wind moved gently through the chimes I had recently replaced. The sound wasn't identical to the old ones, but it carried its own quiet music. I realized that healing didn't mean returning to who I was before. It meant becoming someone stronger, someone who understood the value of boundaries and self-respect. Months later, my sister invited me to a small family gathering. I almost declined, but curiosity pulled me there. The atmosphere felt different without the heavy expectations that once defined every interaction. Conversations stayed light, careful. My mother avoided direct confrontation, speaking politely but keeping her distance. I noticed how age and regret had softened her expression, though it didn't erase the past. At one point she approached me quietly near the kitchen. She said she was proud of how strong I had become. I nodded but didn't respond with the warmth she might have hoped for. Respect was rebuilding slowly, but trust would take much longer. As the evening ended, I stepped outside to breathe in the cool air. My sister joined me, leaning against the railing. She admitted she admired how I handled everything without destroying the family completely. I smiled faintly because she didn't know how many nights I had wanted to walk away forever. Driving home afterward, I realized something had shifted. The anger that once filled every thought had faded into something calmer. Not forgiveness in the traditional sense, but acceptance that the past no longer controlled my future. Back in my condo, I made tea and sat by the window, watching lights flicker across neighboring buildings. The space felt alive again, not just as a place I owned but as a reflection of who I had become. Stronger, wiser, less willing to shrink for the comfort of others. I opened my journal and wrote a single sentence that felt like a promise to myself. I wrote that survival wasn't the end of the story. Living fully, with open eyes and steady boundaries, was the real victory. And for the first time since the day I woke up from surgery to a life that had been taken from me, I felt at peace with the quiet, knowing it belonged entirely to me now. The weeks that followed felt steadier, like the ground beneath me had finally stopped shifting. I woke earlier than I used to, letting morning light stretch across the living room, while the city slowly came alive. There was something comforting about ordinary days returning, answering emails, cooking simple meals, watering the plants on the balcony. For so long my life had revolved around crisis, and now calm felt unfamiliar but welcome. One afternoon I received an unexpected call from the insurance representative handling the final details of the case. They confirmed everything had been settled, and that no further legal steps were required from me. When I hung up, I sat quietly for a long time, letting the realization settle in. There would be no more court dates, no more statements, no more revisiting the same painful memories for evidence. The chapter had officially closed. I thought I would feel triumphant, but instead there was a soft emptiness, like finishing a long journey and suddenly not knowing where to walk next. Healing wasn't loud. It arrived slowly, in moments where nothing dramatic happened at all. Work became more fulfilling as I allowed myself to focus fully again. I accepted a new project that required traveling to different neighborhoods, meeting people I would have never crossed paths with before. Listening to their stories reminded me that everyone carried invisible battles. Some of them spoke about betrayal, loss, or rebuilding from nothing, and I felt a quiet connection with strangers who understood resilience without needing details. One evening after a long day, I stopped by a small bookstore near my building. The owner recognized me from previous visits and recommended a novel about starting over after heartbreak. I bought it without reading the summary, trusting her intuition. That night, I curled up on the couch and lost myself in someone else's story for hours. It felt like giving my mind permission to rest. My sister began reaching out more often, sending small updates about her life instead of heavy conversations. At first I responded cautiously, keeping the tone polite but distant. Over time, we found a rhythm that felt safer. She stopped defending our mother and started listening more. One evening she admitted she'd begun therapy too, trying to understand why she ignored signs that something wasn't right. Hearing that softened something inside me, though I kept my boundaries clear. Winter arrived quietly, bringing cooler air that drifted through the open windows. I rearranged the living room furniture, creating a space that felt entirely new. The act of moving things around symbolized more than decoration. It felt like reclaiming control over my environment. Every decision belonged to me now. The first holiday season after everything happened felt strange. In the past, gatherings were loud and crowded, filled with expectations that often left me exhausted. This time I chose something different. I invited a few close friends over for a small dinner, instead of attending the usual family celebration. We cooked together, laughed over small mistakes in the kitchen, and shared stories late into the night. The warmth of chosen connections filled the space in a way I hadn't realized I needed. After everyone left, I stepped onto the balcony and looked at the lights scattered across the city. The air felt crisp, and the chimes moved gently in the breeze. I thought about how far I had come from the person who woke up from surgery feeling powerless. Strength didn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looked like quiet decisions to build a different life. A few days later, my mother sent another message. This time it wasn't long or complicated. She simply asked if we could meet for coffee sometime, no pressure. I stared at the message for a while before replying that I needed more time. My response felt honest, not harsh. The difference mattered. As months passed, I started noticing small changes within myself. I laughed more easily. I trusted my instincts without second-guessing them. When someone asked for a favor that felt uncomfortable, I said no without guilt. These shifts felt subtle but powerful, like learning a new language where my own needs finally had a voice. One rainy afternoon, I found myself revisiting old hobbies I had abandoned years ago. I pulled out a box of art supplies and began sketching on the balcony while listening to soft music. The lines were imperfect, but the process felt freeing. Creating something just for myself reminded me that my identity extended far beyond the role of daughter or victim. Time continued moving forward, bringing moments of joy alongside occasional waves of sadness. Healing wasn't a straight path. Some days memories resurfaced unexpectedly, a smell, a song, a passing thought that reminded me of how everything changed. Instead of pushing those feelings away, I allowed them to exist without judgment. One evening, as I walked home from work, I passed a building that resembled the hospital where my surgery had taken place. For a brief moment my chest tightened, but I kept walking, breathing steadily until the tension faded. I realized I was no longer defined by that moment of vulnerability. It was part of my story, not the end of it. Spring arrived again, bringing warmth that filled the apartment with golden light. The plants on my balcony had grown stronger, their leaves stretching toward the sun. Watching them thrive felt symbolic of my own journey. Growth didn't erase the past, but it proved that life continued to expand in unexpected ways. One quiet evening, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was a woman thanking me for speaking up during the legal process, because she had experienced something similar with her own family. She said reading about my case gave her courage to seek help. I didn't know how she found my contact, but her words stayed with me long after I replied. It reminded me that standing up for myself had ripple effects beyond my own life. Late at night I sat at the dining table with a cup of tea, reflecting on how different everything felt now. The home around me wasn't just a physical space, it was a reflection of resilience. Every object held a quiet story of survival and renewal. I opened my journal again, flipping through earlier entries filled with anger and confusion. The contrast between those pages and the person I had become felt profound. I wasn't healed in a perfect way, but I was whole in a way that felt authentic. As the evening faded into night, I closed the windows and listened to the gentle sound of the chimes. For the first time in a long while, I felt no need to look back or question what could have been different. The future stretched ahead quietly, filled with possibilities that belonged entirely to me.